Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Review. This is a series in which I look at generally recent works in philosophy as it applies to life, relationships, career, all those sorts of matters. So there's some overlap with personal development, leadership, organizational literature. And today, what we're going to be looking at is something really solidly within the realm of philosophy, pretty much focused on personal identity. It's David Velleman's On Being Me, a very short work. So it's been recently brought out. This is 2020. So I'll tell you what I think about this book. I generally begin by talking about three S's: style, summary, and structure. Now, this is a very short book. It's only 91 pages total, with quite a few of these pages actually just having a little bit of stuff on them or being kind of blank. And it's organized into chapters. Each of the chapters is pretty short. Chapter 1 is Being Glad I Was Born, which has to do with, natality and what does it mean to be a person who's being born. Chapter 2, Wanting to Go On, about continuity. Chapter 3, Fearing the End, thinking about, what is it that happens when we die? Who is it that dies? Chapter 4, Regretting What Might Have Been, thinking about, we might call them counterfactuals or alternate selves, those who we didn't become. Chapter 5, Aspiring to Authorship, thinking about one's life as something like something that one is writing or performing or developing. Chapter 6 is focused on agency in particular. It's called Making Things Happen. And then it finishes up with Chapter 7, Wanting to Be Loved, talking about, who is it and why is that person loved, and what does that actually mean? So each of these is, as the little blurb says, a personal reflection on daily life, but also on sort of the big picture items. And Velleman is leading you through that. The style is, pretty readable. There's almost no citations or bringing up other philosophers. And Velleman tells us that, listen, I've done enough work on these sorts of things in my philosophical scholarship. These are going to be first-person reflections. So that's, more or less the structure and summary of the work. It's him musing and meditating about ideas, issues within philosophy, dealing with ethics, personal identity, and some other related things. I guess you could say metaphysics, epistemology. And the style itself, it's quite readable. I'm going to talk a bit more about the style later on, but there's nothing here, I think, that's going to be particularly difficult for the average reader. There's not really that much more to say in this part about the work. What are the key ideas and insights of this work? I guess you could say that if there's one thing to sum it all up, it's that what it means to be a person is more complex than where we start out in our thinking about it. Because what Velleman is doing with each of these issues is starting with a topic or set of topics and then kind of, meandering around and thinking about it, bringing in some distinctions that he finds helpful, puzzling about those as well. And he does arrive at some conclusions here and there. I'll just give you an example here. So he talks about the desire to eat a meal later on, and he says, these feelings are investments in the future in the sense that they envision surviving until they can be resolved, discharged, paid off. And in envisioning their future resolution, they don't identify the person who will experience it. They pick him out merely as the subject of that experience. in wanting that I enjoy a bowl of chili at noon, I am referring to the subject who will still be feeling this hunger at noon and will remember, I've been wanting this all morning, and I'm referring to that subject, and thinking of him as referring to me, I've been wanting, irrespective of who either of us may be. So, I think that kind of gives you a little flavor, pun intended, for what's going on in this work. It's all sorts of little paths into talking about mundane, everyday experiences and their bigger implications. And so, he pitches this in his introduction as a bunch of reflections on personhood and other things as well. He tells us that a person is a convoluted sort of thing to be, and that's quite good. So another thing that comes up that I think is quite interesting is the range of issues that are being discussed. So he's delving into how we use the term I in our language, and what personal identity over time actually is. Issues of continuity, what happens when we make choices or commitments. All of these sorts of things are well worth investigating. And, you can't approach them with this personal invitation to philosophy. I don't think there's much more to say about key ideas in this, other than, he does have his finger on the pulse of a number of different important topics, let's say. So let's talk about what's good about this work. The style is, as I mentioned, quite readable. I don't think it's going to be particularly challenging for the average reader. This is the sort of book that you could easily read in an afternoon and have plenty of time for taking little pauses and thinking about what it is that Velleman is telling us. And it is indeed raising and musing about and investigating some really important issues that have been recognized as such throughout the history of philosophy. And it's doing so in a way that's quite relatable, I think, for a lot of readers. I won't say for all. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And, I would say that if you read through the work, you are going to find some interesting insights here and there and some useful analogies or ways of digging into examples that you probably then could apply to your own life. The other thing that I'll say is early on in the work that I think is kind of funny, and I'm going to read this verbatim. He says, academic philosophers who read this book will say, but there are no arguments. Let me be the first to say it, there are no arguments. There are only observations of what being a person is like for me and my speculations as to why it might be like that. And he says, most of these observations and speculations have appeared in my academic publications, sometimes supported by more or less formal arguments. For many years, I thought the arguments were meant to convince the reader, but then I found myself oddly unconcerned when few, if any, readers were convinced. I finally realized that I've all along been reporting on personal explorations, composing dispatches from an examined life. My main hope has been that these dispatches will be of interest even without a demonstration that they're true of persons in general. And so I kind of like that. I think that's an interesting thing to point out. It's also sort of an admission of the poverty of the work and of the perspectives involved in it. But I think it is kind of funny to say, there are no arguments in this, and I'm not providing that sort of thing because I've done that elsewhere, and I'm not really that interested in the arguments, and I never really have been that interested in the arguments. So I think that's kind of a cool insight. And here's one other thing that's also coming from this. He says that I'm aware of and embarrassed by the similarities between the inner monologue of this book and that of Descartes in his Meditations. Pretending to be a 21st century Descartes would be ridiculous. I prefer to think that I'm simply accepting his challenge to philosophize from the inside out. And so there's kind of a humility there. about the project and the prospects and how seriously we're supposed to take that. So these are all, I'd say, good points about the work. What do I find problematic about the work? So here is where we get to the point of the review where I actually do have quite a few things to say, because I'm going to say personally I did not enjoy this book. I found it, without being dry, I found it dull. And without being tiresome, I found it kind of tedious. And I think to myself, as sort of the things he brings up in here, the time I devoted to this, I could have been doing so many other things. And I think that one of the big issues in the work is revealed in the references that Velleman is making. He's got acknowledgments in here, and he's got some readings. The readings are all basically from either his own stuff or analytic philosophy on these issues, and they are important people to read, like Harry Frankfurt, great thinker, Thomas Nagel, Bernard Williams, well worth reading. But, they're not the only people who talk about this stuff, and I think they talk about it in more interesting ways than Velleman himself does in this work. He also, talks about other people, Elizabeth Anscombe, Daniel Dennett, Christine Korsgaard, Iris Murdoch, and bringing that up, it's interesting because take, for example, Iris Murdoch. She's really fun and interesting to read. This just isn't. And I'm not quite sure exactly where it lies or how much we can generalize. It could be that you read this book and you find it really brilliant and insightful and enjoyable and all those sorts of things. This might be a purely subjective set of preferences. But it's almost as if he just didn't engage enough with the many other thinkers who talk about these issues, because there's an entire world out there, and many of these issues go way, way back into philosophy. And I understand that Velleman really wants to focus on his own experience, but I think that may be another area where it suffers as well, because he's writing about what it's like to be a professor living in New York, basically living out this academic life that's kind of, going along quite well in many respects, and debating about whether he should do this or that, and referencing playing tennis or dancing and all that. And myself, personally, when I read this, I'm like, yeah, that's not the kind of person whose life I actually care much about or want to use to scrutinize these really important issues of personal identity and continuity over time and choices that we make. It's just, there's something kind of provincial about it, the sort of provinciality that you have in the people who view everybody else as being provincials because they're at the center of what they take to be the world, and it's just not that interesting. I don't find it very illuminating to read his musings about these issues. I think there are arguments in there. I don't think that they're particularly compelling, and I think that's where I have to sort of leave it. The other thing that I will say about the work is, if this is supposed to be a personal invitation to philosophy, it doesn't feel like it's actually bringing the reader in. And the reference to Descartes is really quite extraordinary, because there's so many other people who did things like this, personal introspection. I don't think this has much resemblance to Descartes' meditations at all, because Descartes is really great at bringing the reader in and making them say, oh, yeah, wow, well, that's really an issue. Descartes, you might say, has a sort of, despite the fact that Descartes says rhetoric is no good, Descartes is an amazing rhetorician in his works. This just doesn't do it. And maybe I'm totally off base. Maybe this is just a function of things not syncing up right. Maybe most readers really do enjoy this, but I personally have a hard time envisioning that as a possibility. So I don't see it as a personal invitation to philosophy. I see it more as a let's see what David Velleman did when he was thinking about stuff along the way, and maybe some of it's relevant to our own lives, but we'd really have to draw those implications out ourselves. The other last thing that I'll say about that is this book is $12.95, so you're not getting much in terms of the money that you're spending on it. You know, it's the sort of thing that if you wanted to blow $12.95 and like maybe read it on the train, or you know, as you're sitting waiting for appointments or something like that, it could be quite good to do, but I just don't see getting that much out of this $12.95 book. So, final thoughts. There is one aspect of the book that I actually failed to mention in talking about it, and that is that it does have a number of nice drawings by Emily Bernstein, but you know, they're kind of in pace with the rest of the book. They're her views on what Velleman is talking about. I don't recommend the book. I don't say across the board don't get it. If you're into this sort of confessional literature, let's call it confessional light, with some musings about philosophical topics, it couldn't be bad to get. I just think that your time and money and thought could be way better spent on other philosophy things. So I give it a sort of qualified don't get this book. If you're into this sort of thing, by all means get it, but I don't think most readers are going to find it all that rewarding to read this.